Welcome to the deep dive. We take complex academic stuff today. It's an advanced lecture digging into how the Roman Empire really worked, how it rose and fell, and basically give you the inside track. We're skipping the high school version. We want to pull out those core mechanisms, the levers of power and the fault lines of collapse that historians really grapple with.
Yeah, the scope today is just massive. We're talking well over 1,000 years. We're looking at Rome from its very murky beginnings, supposedly this small city-state on the Tiber.
The whole Romulus and Remus thing.
Exactly, the myth-making.
Hmm.
Right through its peak is this, well, superpower straddling continents, and then charting that long, messy decline and fragmentation.
And we're really focusing on the system underneath it all, not just the big battles or famous emperors, though we'll touch on those. Rome's influence. I mean, it's baked into our legal systems, our languages, even how we think about government, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Its legacy didn't just vanish, it morphed, it transformed. And what you see in the serious scholarship is this kind of inherent paradox.
How so?
Well, the rise was all about incredible adaptability, military innovation, relentless expansion, and frankly, engineering genius. But the fall, it wasn't just, barbarians kicking down the gates. That's too simple.
It was more internal.
Much more. A slow burn, really. Deep political rot, economic weakness, the sheer impossibility of managing such a colossal, expensive structure. The external threats were real, absolutely, but they exploited existing weaknesses.
Okay, so our mission here is to unpack those systemic gears, the successes and the failures, and pull out the key insights for you. Understanding Rome, it really does feel like understanding a blueprint for how power works and how it can unravel. Let's start right at the beginning then. How does a small settlement in Italy become Rome?
Right, the Romans themselves loved a good origin story. 753 BCE, Romulus and Remus, twins abandoned, raised by a she-wolf. It's dramatic.
And symbolic, presumably. Gave them a sense of destiny.
Hugely important for their self-image, yes. It projected this idea of divine favor, toughness, a kind of fated dominance. It was powerful cultural glue for centuries.
But archaeology tells a different story, a less wolf-involved one.
Yes, a bit more practical. What the archaeology suggests is more like around the 8th century BCE, you have these small villages on the hills near the Tiber River, strategically good spots, defensible, and they start merging.
Safety in numbers, maybe control of a river crossing for trade.
Exactly. Geography, necessity. And early Rome wasn't the big player yet. It was actually ruled by kings, and interestingly, many of these kings were Etruscans, or at least heavily influenced by them.
The Etruscans were the more advanced civilization to the north, right?
Yeah, technologically more sophisticated at the time. They gave Rome some critical early tools, things like advanced engineering for drainage, city planning, and crucially, the architectural arch.
The arch seems like a specific detail, but was it that important?
Oh, fundamental. The arch lets you build bigger, stronger structures, bridges, aqueducts, arenas. It distributes weight incredibly efficiently. It's a visual signature of Roman power, and it starts here with Etruscan know-how.
Okay, so they absorbed that. Then comes the big shift away from kings, the Republic.
That's the first major institutional revelation. Around 509 BCE, the story goes, the Roman nobles, the patricians, got fed up with the last king, Tarquin the Proud, supposedly a tyrant, and kicked him out.
And instead of just another king, they set up what exactly?
A res publica, literally a public affair or a public thing. A system led by elected officials, most importantly 2 consuls, elected annually to prevent one person holding power too long.
Now, the Republic wasn't exactly power to the people initially, was it? There was this tension between the elite patricians and the commoners, the plebeians.
A huge tension. And this is where Roman political development gets really interesting. The early Republic story is defined by this struggle, the conflict of the orders.
How did the plebeians actually gain rights? Was it violent revolution?
Sometimes there was unrest, but their most effective tool was actually nonviolent. Incredibly clever. It was called the secessio plebis, the secession of the plebes. Basically, yeah, they'd withdraw from the city en masse. No soldiers, no farmers, no workers. The city would grind to a halt. It was a kind of general strike, and it forced the patricians to negotiate.
That's remarkable political leverage. What did they achieve with that?
Key concessions. They got their own officials, the tribunes of the plebs, who had veto power over the Senate and consuls and were considered sacrosanct. You couldn't harm them. And crucially, they forced the laws to be written down publicly, the 12 tables.
So everyone knew the rules. No more arbitrary decisions by the elite.
Exactly. It established a principle of known law. This whole system, Senate, representing the aristocracy, assemblies for the people, elected magistrates, the tribunes, it was complex, messy, but incredibly resilient and sophisticated for its time.
And this internal strength allowed them to look outwards.
It provided the stability, the manpower, the organization needed for expansion. First, they systematically conquered the Italian peninsula, and they had this quite unique approach of often granting citizenship or partial rights to the people they conquered.
So they weren't just subjects, they became part of the Roman system,
Wow.
integrated them.
Yes, which expanded their military manpower enormously. And that success inevitably led them head-to-head with the other major power in the Western Med, Carthage.
North Africa, modern Tunisia, a big trading empire.
Huge maritime power. Rich, established. This was the collision course. It wasn't just about territory. It was about who would control the sea lanes, the trade, the future of the whole region.
The Punic Wars, this is where Rome really becomes Rome, isn't it?
Absolutely. 3 brutal wars spanning over a century. They defined Rome. And the standout figure, the one everyone remembers, is Hannibal in the Second Punic War.
Crossing the Alps with elephants, it sounds like something out of fantasy.
It was an incredible feat of logistics and sheer audacity. He didn't just pop over the mountains. He brought tens of thousands of infantry, cavalry, and these war elephants, basically tanks of the ancient world, right into Italy's backyard.
And inflicted some massive defeats on Rome.
Devastating defeats. Cannae, in particular, was catastrophic for Rome. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers killed in a single battle. It's still studied today as a tactical masterpiece by Hannibal.
Yet Rome didn't collapse.
That's the key Roman characteristic, resilience. They took horrific losses, but just refused to break. They had deep manpower reserves, incredible determination, and eventually, under generals like Scipio Africanus, they took the fight to Carthage itself.
And won. Utterly.
By 146 BCE, Carthage was completely destroyed. Rome was the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. But, and this is crucial, this victory came at a massive internal cost.
The paradox you mentioned earlier, success breeding failure.
Precisely. The Republic's institutions, designed for a small city-state, were completely overwhelmed by the consequences of this massive victory.
Okay, let's trace that mechanism. How did winning lead to instability?
Well, first, unimaginable amounts of wealth flooded into Rome. Plunder, tribute, slaves. But it didn't benefit everyone equally. Not by a long shot.
It went to the top. The generals, the elites.
Overwhelmingly. They used this new capital to buy up vast tracts of land in Italy, creating enormous agricultural estates called latifundia, worked primarily by cheap slave labor captured in the wars.
And what happened to the small farmers? The backbone of the old Roman army.
They couldn't compete. Their farms were often neglected while they were away fighting for years. They came back, often in debt, and found they couldn't match the prices of the slave-run megafarms. They lost their land.
So they flooded into the cities.
Into Rome, mostly, creating this huge, landless, unemployed urban population, the proletariat. Deeply impoverished, politically volatile, and disconnected from the traditional Roman way of life.
So the success of the legions abroad basically destroyed the class that filled those legions.
In a nutshell, yes.
Yeah.
And this crisis led to figures like the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. Towards the end of the 2nd century BCE, they saw the problem.
They tried land reform, right? To redistribute land back to small farmers.
They did. It was a direct attempt to address this structural crisis. But the wealthy senatorial class saw it as an attack on their property, their power.
And it ended badly for the Gracchi.
Both were murdered by political mobs backed by senators. It was a turning point. It showed that the Republic's political system could no longer resolve fundamental conflicts peacefully. Violence became the tool.
And when politics fails, the military steps in.
Exactly. Around the same time, you get military reforms, particularly under Gaius Marius. He started recruiting soldiers from the landless proletariat, promising them pay, land, and spoils.
So soldiering becomes a job, not a citizen's duty.
A career. And crucially, these soldiers weren't loyal to the Senate or the abstract idea of the Republic anymore. They were loyal to their general, the man who recruited them, led them to victory, and guaranteed their retirement package.
That sounds dangerous. Personal armies.
It was the death knell for the Republic. These generals, with their loyal legions, started using them not just against foreign enemies, but against each other, against Rome itself. The 1st century BCE becomes a bloodbath of civil wars. Marius versus Sulla, Pompey versus Caesar. The Republic was tearing itself apart.
Which brings us to Julius Caesar. He feels like the culmination of everything you just described. Brilliant general, populist appeal, immense personal ambition.
He absolutely embodies the late Republic's crisis. His campaigns in Gaul, modern France, were incredibly successful, bringing vast territory and wealth under Roman control and making him immensely popular with his troops and the people.
But the Senate feared him, saw him as aiming too high.
They saw him as a potential king, the ultimate Roman taboo. They ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. He refused.
The famous crossing of the Rubicon River.
In 49 BCE, it was a small river, but the symbolic boundary between his province and Italy proper. Crossing it with his army was an act of treason, an open declaration of civil war. Alia acta est, the die is cast.
And he won that war. Became the most powerful man in Rome.
Victorious, yes. He was declared dictator initially, a temporary emergency office, but he eventually took it for life. He pushed through many reforms, calendar reform, debt relief, settling veterans. He was effective, but his power was absolute.
Too absolute for some. The Ides of March, 44 BCE.
A group of senators, led by Brutus and Cassius, assassinated him in the Senate House itself. They genuinely seemed to believe that killing the tyrant would magically restore the old republic.
But it didn't work out that way.
Not at all. It just unleashed another, even more brutal round of civil wars. The main players eventually boiled down to Caesar's adopted son and heir, Octavian, versus Caesar's right-hand man, Mark Antony, who famously allied with Cleopatra of Egypt.
And Octavian came out on top.
Decisively. The Battle of Actium in 31 BCE sealed it. Antony and Cleopatra were defeated, later committed suicide. Octavian stood alone, the undisputed master of the Roman world.
So he becomes the first emperor. But wasn't quite that simple, was it? He learned from Caesar's fate.
He was incredibly politically astute. He knew Romans hated the idea of a king. So in 27 BCE, the Senate granted him the title Augustus, meaning revered or majestic, and he carefully constructed a new system, the Principate.
Principate meaning rule by the princeps.
Yes, princes meaning first citizen. He presented himself not as a monarch, but as the restorer of the republic, the first among equals. He kept the Senate, the consuls, all the old republican offices.
But it was a facade.
A brilliant facade. He held the real power. Direct command over the most important legions, control of key provinces like Egypt, the breadbasket, vast personal wealth, and the loyalty of the army. The republic was effectively dead, but the appearance was maintained. This was his genius.
And this system actually brought stability after decades of civil war.
Remarkably so. This marks the beginning of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. Roughly 2 centuries of relative internal peace, stability, and prosperity across the empire.
And the empire reached its maximum size during this time.
Yes, around the 2nd century CE, under emperors like Trajan and Hadrian. It stretched from Britain in the northwest, across Europe, North Africa, all the way to Mesopotamia in the east. An enormous entity.
Managing something that vast, it must have required more than just legions. What was the administrative backbone?
It was a combination of things. First, incredible infrastructure. Those famous Roman roads, maybe 400,000 kilometers of them, paved and engineered, weren't just for moving goods.
Military highways.
Communication lines.
Exactly. Rapid troop deployment, official communications via the imperial post, cursus publicus, and, crucially, allowing tax collectors and administrators to reach everywhere. They connected the empire physically.
And legally. How did they govern so many different peoples?
They developed a sophisticated and relatively standardized legal system. Roman law became incredibly influential. They had civil law, minutes for citizens, but also developed the Insextigentium, the law of nations, based on common principles to deal pragmatically with non-citizens and provincials. It created predictability, which is vital for large-scale trade. Standardized currency, too, I assume.
Yes, the gold aureus and silver denarius were recognized and accepted pretty much everywhere. Made trade across vast distances much easier, though funding the army and the bureaucracy was always a huge expense.
What about culturally? Did Rome impose its culture everywhere?
It was more complex than that. Rome was heavily influenced by Greek culture, philosophy, art, literature. This Hellenization was central to elite Roman education. But Rome's genius was often in adopting and adapting, making things practical, large scale.
Like engineering, perhaps, taking Greek ideas and scaling them up.
Precisely. And language was key. Latin became the language of administration, law, and the military throughout the West. It unified diverse regions. And of course, modern Romance languages, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, evolved directly from the vulgar Latin spoken across the empire.
And the big public works, aqueducts, Colosseum, Pantheon, they weren't just functional.
They were symbols of power, of Roman order, of the benefits of Roman rule. Providing clean water with massive aqueducts, entertainment and amphitheaters, impressive temples. These demonstrated the high standard of living Rome could offer which helped integrate conquered peoples. It was a form of propaganda, really, showing that being Roman meant civilization. But even during the height of the Pax Romana, under that veneer of grandeur and stability, serious structural problems were developing. They really started to bite in the 3rd century CE.
So the Golden Age wasn't quite as solid as it looked. What were the cracks?
A key weakness was the system's dependence on the emperor's personal qualities. The Principate, Augustus's system, worked well with competent rulers. But with weak, corrupt, or just plain bad emperors, the whole thing became fragile.
And power became more openly authoritarian, less of that first citizen pretense.
Increasingly, yes. Emperors relied more on the army, less on the Senate. Rule by fear rather than consensus became more common, and the administrative burden just kept growing.
The cost of running this massive empire.
Exactly. Maintaining the legions needed to guard thousands of miles of frontier. Plus, the vast bureaucracy needed to manage taxes and administration. The expenses were astronomical. And eventually, the revenue couldn't keep up.
Especially if expansion slowed down, meaning less plunder coming in.
Precisely. The frontier solidified. The easy conquests were over. Now it was about defense, which is expensive. So the state needed more money.
Which meant higher taxes.
Crushing taxes in many cases. Burdening the population, especially farmers and merchants. And when taxes weren't enough, the emperors resorted to a disastrous quick fix. Debasing the currency.
Okay, explain that. How does debasing work and why is it so bad?
So the standard silver coin was the denarius. To make more coins without having more silver, they started mixing in cheaper metals, copper, tin, lead, dessari, but kept the coin stamped with the same face value.
So less actual silver in each coin, but it still says denarius.
Right. They're literally reducing the intrinsic value. Initially, maybe it's a small reduction, but over time, especially when emperors were desperate for cash to pay the army, the silver content plummeted.
And people noticed.
Oh, absolutely. Soldiers, merchants, anyone handling money realized the coins weren't worth what they used to be. This leads directly to runaway inflation. Prices skyrocket because the money itself is becoming worthless.
A total loss of confidence in the currency.
Complete collapse of faith. People start hoarding good silver coins if they can find them, or demanding payment in goods, in land, in anything but the increasingly worthless official money. Trade grinds to a halt. The economy tanks.
And this economic chaos fuels political chaos.
Directly. This whole period, roughly 235 to 284 CE, is known as the crisis of the 3rd century. It was 50 years of almost constant civil war, invasion, and economic meltdown.
How bad did the political instability get?
It was staggering. Historians count something like 20-plus legitimate emperors in those 50 years, plus countless usurpers and pretenders. Many ruled for only a year or two before being murdered, often by their own troops.
The army becomes the real power broker.
Entirely. They became known as the soldier emperors. Loyalty wasn't to Rome, it was to the general who could promise the biggest bonus, often paid in that debased currency or land grants. If a general couldn't deliver, or another promised more, coup followed coup.
So while Rome is busy fighting itself,
The borders become vulnerable, exactly. In the east, the powerful Sassanid Persian Empire launched major attacks, even capturing one Roman emperor. In Europe, Germanic tribes like the Goths, Franks, and Alemanni started pouring across the Rhine and Danube rivers.
the internal chaos made effective defense impossible.
Pretty much. The lack of central authority was so severe that parts of the empire actually broke away temporarily, the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, just to try and maintain some local order and defense. The whole structure was fracturing. The person who finally pulled the empire back from the brink, at least temporarily, was Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in 284 CE. He was a tough military man and a radical reformer.
He realized the old system just couldn't be patched up anymore.
He knew fundamental changes were needed. He essentially abandoned the Augustan Principate model and created a much more openly autocratic system, the dominant. And his most famous reform was structural.
The Tetrarchy, rule by 4.
Yes. He figured the empire was simply too big for one man to rule effectively, especially during crises. So he divided it into an eastern and a western half. Each half had a senior emperor, an Augustus, and a junior emperor, or heir apparent, a Caesar.
So 4 rulers coordinating defense and administration across the whole territory.
That was the idea. And it did bring a measure of stability for a while. Diocletian himself ruled the east, the wealthier and more stable part. But the division, even if intended to be administrative, created a permanent split in focus and resources.
It acknowledged that the East and West were already diverging.
It formalized it. The East had major cities, established trade routes, a more urbanized population. The West was more rural, had longer, more vulnerable land frontiers with the Germanic tribes, and was generally less wealthy.
Did the Tetrarchy system last after Diocletian?
Not really. Diocletian actually retired, which was unusual, but the plan for peaceful succession immediately fell apart into, you guessed it, more civil war.
So the division ended up being more permanent than the system designed to manage it.
Pretty much. The winner who emerged from those wars was Constantine the Great.
Famous for legalizing Christianity.
Yes, but also for another hugely consequential decision. He briefly reunited the empire under his sole rule, but then, in 330 CE, he established a new capital.
Not Rome.
No. He chose the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, strategically located on the Bosphorus Strait, and rebuilt it as Constantinople, modern Istanbul.
Why there? What was the advantage?
Immense advantages. Highly defensible peninsula, control of the vital sea route between Europe and Asia, the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It was perfectly positioned to command the richer, more defensible eastern provinces.
But what did this mean for Rome, the city, and the Western Empire?
It accelerated the shift of power, wealth, and focus eastward. Rome remained symbolically important, but the real political and economic engine was now Constantinople. The West increasingly became a poorer, more militarized, and struggling frontier zone.
And the pressure on those western frontiers just kept mounting. From the barbarian tribes?
Yes, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Franks, Angles, Saxons, and then the Huns pushing from further east, causing a kind of domino effect. It's important to remember these weren't always organized invasions in the modern sense. Often they were mass migrations of entire peoples looking for land and safety.
And Rome's response was sometimes to let them in.
Yes, the policy of using them as foederati federates or allies. They'd grant tribes land within the empire's borders in exchange for providing soldiers for the Roman army.
Seems pragmatic, but did it work?
It was a short-term fix with long-term problems. You basically ended up with large armed groups inside your territory whose loyalty was primarily to their own leaders, not the Roman emperor. You were essentially ceding control.
And eventually these groups turned on Rome itself.
The breaking point, psychologically at least, was in 410 CE. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, who had previously served Rome as a foederatus but felt betrayed, marched on Rome and actually sacked the city.
The Eternal City, fallen, that must have been a massive shock.
Unthinkable. It sent shockwaves across the empire. If Rome itself wasn't safe, what was? After that, the fragmentation of the West accelerated. Britain was abandoned, Gaul fell largely under Frankish control, Spain to the Visigoths, and crucially, North Africa, Rome's main source of grain, was conquered by the Vandals.
So the Western Empire was just dissolving into successor kingdoms.
Piece by piece. The emperors in the West became increasingly powerless, often puppets of powerful Germanic generals commanding what was left of the army.
Until the final date we always hear, 476 CE.
That's the traditional marker. A Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a teenager ironically named Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus.
Did Odoacer declare himself emperor?
No, and this is significant. He basically sent the imperial insignia, the symbols of office, the fancy robes and stuff, back to the Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, saying effectively, we don't need an emperor in the West anymore. He declared himself king of Italy instead.
So 476 marks the end of the Western Roman Empire, but not the whole thing.
Crucial distinction. The political structure in the West collapsed, replaced by various Germanic kingdoms. But the Eastern Roman Empire, centered on Constantinople, which historians often call the Byzantine Empire to distinguish it, continued.
For how long?
For almost another 1,000 years. It preserved Roman law, administration, and Greek culture, finally falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. So Rome didn't entirely fall in 476. One half of it transformed, the other half continued.
Okay, so the Western political structure crumbles, replaced by these new kingdoms. But Rome's influence didn't just evaporate, did it? What lasted?
So much lasted, woven into the fabric of what came next. Let's start with law and governance. Roman law was incredibly sophisticated. Concepts like written codes, property rights, contracts, the idea of law applying universally lex didn't disappear.
They formed the basis for later European legal systems.
Absolutely. The civil law tradition, dominant in continental Europe, Latin America, and elsewhere, traces its roots directly back to Roman law, particularly the massive codification done later by the Eastern Emperor Justinian.
And the very idea of a large organized state.
That's a huge Roman legacy. The concept of a centralized government, a professional bureaucracy managing vast territories with standardized administration. Rome provided the template that medieval kingdoms and later nation-states looked back to and tried to emulate.
What about the physical stuff, the roads, the buildings?
Even as the Western Empire fragmented, the physical infrastructure endured for a long time. Roman roads often remained the best routes for travel and trade for centuries. Roman engineering techniques, especially with arches, vaults, concrete, and water management, influenced architecture right through the Middle Ages and Renaissance.
And then there's Christianity. It started as a persecuted minority religion within the empire.
A small Jewish sect initially, heavily persecuted at times. But it spread, and then Emperor Constantine's conversion and legalization in the early 4th century changed everything. Later, it became the official state religion under Emperor Theodosius.
So the imperial structure actually helped the church grow and organize.
Massively. The church adopted the Roman administrative structure. Provinces became dioceses, cities had bishops, and crucially, when the political authority collapsed in the West in the 5th century, the church, particularly the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, was one of the few large-scale organized institutions left standing.
It stepped into the power vacuum.
To a significant extent, yes. It provided continuity, a sense of order, and critically, the monasteries became centers of learning. During the so-called Dark Ages, it was monks who preserved literacy, copied manuscripts, and kept alive not just Christian texts, but also classical Roman literature and philosophy in Latin.
So Latin survived through the church.
Largely, yes. It remained the language of scholarship, diplomacy, and the church across Western Europe for over 1,000 years, long after it ceased to be a commonly spoken language. So in many ways, you could argue Rome never truly fell in the sense of disappearing completely. It transformed. Its political and military power in the West dissolved, but its legal, linguistic, religious, and cultural DNA profoundly shaped medieval and modern Europe.
The ghost in the machine, as you said earlier.
Exactly. Its influence is everywhere, even if we don't always recognize it. #outro.
What an incredible journey. From tiny villages to a world-spanning empire, and then its gradual fragmentation. It really underscores how complex the dynamics of power are.
Absolutely. The story of Rome is a masterclass, really, in how states rise and fall. Success requires that blend of military strength, yes, but also adaptable institutions, economic stability, and some way of integrating diverse populations.
The rise seems built on that unity, discipline, the clever use of citizenship, that administrative genius.
But the fall warns us about internal decay. Corruption, the immense cost of overexpansion, the dangers of extreme inequality generated by that very success, and maybe political systems that become too rigid or too dependent on individuals. The Principate was brilliant, but ultimately fragile.
Still, the ideas Rome hammered out, the rule of law, the duties and rights of citizenship, the whole project of creating order out of chaos, those feel incredibly relevant.
They are foundational to Western political thought, without a doubt.
Right.
Even when the empire itself was gone, the idea of Rome and the structures it left behind continued to shape the world.
Which brings us to our final thought, something for you, our listeners, to chew on after this deep dive.
Yeah, think about this. The Roman Empire, arguably the most successful, long-lasting state structure in Western history, ultimately faltered, in part because the costs of maintaining its global reach, its military, its administration, combined with crippling internal inequality and financial mismanagement through things like currency debasement, simply overwhelmed its ability to cope.
So the provocative question is, what lessons does that hold for us today? When we look at modern global systems, powerful nations, international bodies, are they facing similar pressures? The immense cost of global presence, complex administration, vast inequality, debates about fiscal responsibility, and the value of currency.
Are the fundamental challenges faced by Rome managing complexity, inequality, and the sheer cost of power timeless? It's something worth considering. To understand Rome really is, in many ways, to understand the world that followed it, and perhaps the challenges we still face.
A sobering but fascinating thought to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the rise and fall of the Roman Empire.